Right. Okay. So we were talking about succession and then talked about trophic levels and the trophic pyramid and the important practical results that can just the way the trophic pyramid is set up can result in biological magnification, which is important in an ecosystem. That's where that practically becomes of importance for human life. Even organisms that don't eat each other can relate to each other in other ways through various other types of webs of interactions. And here's a simple example. We were talking about prairies earlier. This is a prairie dog. They're not actually dogs, they're rodents. They live on the North American prairie. There is, or there used to be, a sizable colony of them at the Little Rock Zoo. And they live in these great big burrow systems in which you might get hundreds or more prairie dogs living in one big system of burrows called a prairie dog town. Prairie dogs are, of course, part of the trophic pyramid. They eat seeds and plants, and they get eaten by rattlesnakes and hawks, and in the old days, people. But they do more than that. One example of the importance of prairie dogs above and beyond what eats them and what they eat is that old prairie dog burrows are used by a number of other critters that will use them as places to live, one of which is the burrowing owl. Here's a burrowing owl for you nesting in an abandoned prairie dog burrow. Burrowing owls don't actually eat prairie dogs, but they do depend on them because they use abandoned burrows as a nesting site. So organisms can interact with each other in more ways than just eating and being eaten. And organisms that are at the center of these webs of interaction, organisms that a lot of other organisms depend on, are the so-called keystone species. And a keystone species is one whose presence in an ecosystem has a large effect on the ecosystem and the diversity of species in it out of proportion to its actual numbers. If you lose a keystone species, it changes the entire ecosystem fundamentally. In some cases, keystone species are what we call apex predators, which is the organisms at the top of the trophic pyramid, the species that eat anything they want to and nobody eats them. Killer whales, for example, or great white sharks have no natural predators, okay, except for humans killing great white sharks. But aside from us, there may be nobody preying on them. Those would be apex predators, but keystone species don't have to be apex predators, and they may not even be predators at all. The metaphor for keystone species refers to this thing, the keystone of an arch, that little trapezoid-shaped stone that's up at the top of an arch. You can actually get an arch to stand up without mortar. If you have bricks of the right shape, you can build an arch that will support itself even if you don't fasten the bricks together with cement. But if you pull the keystone out, the entire arch collapses. The keystone is the key stone. It's the key to the whole thing staying up. Remove the keystone and the whole thing falls. Remove a keystone species and the entire ecosystem is radically changed. Here's an example, and this is one that is an apex predator and a keystone species at the same time. These are some wolves feeding on an elk. Wolves had been wiped out decades ago in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. They were reintroduced in 1995, and what they primarily feed on is the herds of the herds of elk, herds of another name for these is wapiti, type of deer, and there's some wolves taking down an elk. To stay away from the wolves, the elk started moving to higher ground, and they started moving away from the river valleys. That meant that there were no longer elk grazing in the river valleys, feeding on plants. So riverside plants like willows and aspens started becoming more abundant in the river valleys. The river valleys got more vegetation and more tree growth. That in turn created more habitat for critters like beavers, moose, other animals like that. And when wolves kill elk, they don't manage to eat every last scrap of the carcass. So here you've got the remains of a killed elk getting scavenged by, in this case, a bald eagle. We perhaps like to think of bald eagles as noble and majestic predators, but they actually eat an awful lot of dead stuff. Ravens, that's a magpie on the right. Grizzly bears will happily feed on the leftovers of a wolf kill. So wolves are a keystone species because if they're there, they have effects that ripple through the whole ecosystem and affect everybody from the plants to the birds to the other mammals. And if you take wolves out of the ecosystem, the way we did about a century ago, that has effects that ripple through the whole ecosystem. The ecosystem is not the same if you pull out the wolves. Losing the wolves affects everybody from the plants to the bald eagles and everything in between. And I mentioned prairie dogs earlier. They are not apex predators, but they are a keystone species. They get eaten by foxes, black-footed ferrets, hawks, badgers, things like that. So they're food for higher level predators. And they feed on plants and seeds and things like that. They dig these burrows, and that burrowing activity increases the soil's ability to retain water when it rains. More water can soak into the soil if there are prairie dog burrows in it. That allows more plant species to grow. When there's more plant species to grow, that attracts more grazing animals. The burrows also attract insects that may burrow into the soft soil around the burrows or maybe feed on the plants around burrows. Those attract insect-eating birds. And then the old burrows of prairie dogs are used by things like burrowing owls and also by rabbits, by lizards, critters like that. So if you take prairie dogs out of the ecosystem, everybody's affected from the plants all the way to the hawks. That would be a keystone species that is not an apex predator. These aren't predators, but if you take the prairie dogs out, the entire ecosystem is radically changed. You can't, I guess you could think of this as being kind of like a game of Jenga. You know, in an ecosystem, if you start removing species, some of them might not cause major change, but if you take the wrong block out, then the whole thing collapses. Something similar is going on here. Prairie dogs are that block that will cause the ecosystem to collapse if they're not there. Keystone species. Okay, and they're cute. Right. I talked earlier about how everything goes around in circles, like that song by Billy Preston. Look it up if you don't know. It's a good one. And we talked about how biomass and energy move up trophic pyramids from producers through higher and higher levels of consumers. And then ultimately, everybody dies and gets broken down by the decomposers, and the atoms that made them up ultimately go back around to feed new generations of producers. And so everything cycles. There's lots of natural cycles we have to talk about in ecology. And the easiest one to grasp is probably called the hydrologic cycle. And the driving force here is solar energy, energy from the sun, causes water to evaporate. Water rains down from the atmosphere in the form of rain or snow or hail or sleet or what have you. Rainwater, when it falls on land, runs downhill, usually down my driveway, and into the drainage ditches. And the drainage ditches transport it to where I live, it would be Lake Conway. And ultimately, that water goes from Lake Conway over the dam down, is it Palarm Creek? Down through some creeks and ultimately into the Arkansas River, which goes into the Mississippi River, which ultimately flows into the ocean. Now, when sunlight falls on the oceans, water evaporates from them and goes back into the atmosphere, from whence it will eventually rain back down again, and the cycle keeps going around. Water evaporates, goes into the air, and then it rains out of the air. Some water might actually cut out of the active cycle for a long time. Water that forms snow that falls in the polar regions may ultimately pack down into glacier ice, and it may stay there for centuries or more. Some water that falls on soil soaks in and ultimately soaks into certain layers of rock and forms groundwater. That's the water that springs and wells tap into. So there can be more little detours on the cycle. But the basic outline is water evaporates into the air, water rains down out of the air, wash, rinse, and repeat. So that's a rainstorm over the Pacific Ocean. You can actually see rain fall in the distance. And then there's, of course, sunlight that's making the ocean evaporate. So we've got the complete hydrologic cycle in one photo here. That was pretty easy. I think my kid got that in first grade. Carbon also gets cycled, and the major driving force is photosynthesis and respiration. Plants and other producers like, green photosynthetic protists and blue-green bacteria and things like that have the ability to fix carbon. And what fixing means is taking carbon in the form of a simple gas, carbon dioxide, and converting that carbon into the more complex compounds that they need, into sugars, and ultimately from there into everything else that they need. So photosynthesis sucks carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And then when living things eat plants, or when living things die and get rotted by fungi and bacteria, that process creates carbon dioxide as a waste product. A lot of the carbon that you eat in your food, ultimately you breathe out in the form of carbon dioxide gas. That's one of your waste products. And that goes back into the atmosphere. And that's called respiration. So the combination of photosynthesis and respiration is the main driver of the carbon cycle. You can have other inputs of carbon as well. Fire, for example, puts carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide also gets added by volcanoes, which we do have. Carbon dioxide can also get removed by certain geological processes, like certain minerals weathering, chemically reacting with the air, ultimately takes out carbon dioxide. So there are more ways than just the photosynthesis and respiration for carbon dioxide to cycle. But the big driving force that we'll focus on is photosynthesis and respiration. Little bit of a detour. The atmosphere does not soak up most of the energy that comes from the sun. If the atmosphere did absorb most of that energy, The atmosphere would be very hot and it would be dark on the surface of the Earth. Most of the energy coming from the sun, the atmosphere lets through to reach the surface, as evidenced by the fact that you can see the sun. One exception is a form of oxygen gas called ozone that soaks up medium frequency ultraviolet light. Since medium frequency ultraviolet light damages DNA and contributes to cancer, ozone does a very good thing. And there was concern about the destruction of the ozone layer beginning in about the 1980s. Although by banning chemicals that were doing that, we actually seem to be holding the line there. We seem to be getting our ozone back is the trend. Anyway, but aside from the ultraviolet light that's absorbed by the ozone layer, much of the energy that the sun puts out that strikes the Earth actually goes all the way to the surface. Now, that energy can't be destroyed. It has to do something. And as solar energy hits the Earth, solid Earth and water alike, heat up. You have experienced this if you've ever walked across a parking lot barefoot on a summer day. I used to do that going to the swimming pool when I was a little kid. I didn't like wearing shoes, but we had to cross a hot parking lot, and there's always this kind of dance that you have to do to get across. That parking lot's not heating itself; it's heated because sunlight and other forms of energy are falling on it, causing it to get hot. Now, the thing about hot things is they give energy off, right? The hot parking lot was giving off energy directly into my foot, which hurt. And as the Earth warms, we call that re-radiation. As the Earth warms, the Earth starts giving off more energy, because anything that's warm is giving energy off into space. Here's the thing. The atmosphere lets most of that solar energy pass through if it's coming straight from the sun, but the atmosphere is better at absorbing the energy that the Earth is giving off once it warms up. That energy is mostly a type called infrared. And especially gases in the atmosphere known as water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane. So solar energy passes through the atmosphere and it hits the Earth. When the Earth warms up, it starts giving off infrared radiation. That infrared radiation is absorbed by gases in the atmosphere, including carbon dioxide and methane. And those gases radiate that radiation back to the Earth. You could think of the atmosphere as being like a thermal blanket, right? The reason you put a blanket on a cold night is if you're sleeping out in the open on a cold night, your warmth radiates out into the cold space and you get cold. Put a well-designed blanket on, and your body heat is not radiated out into space, it's trapped and it's kept close to you. That's the point of wearing a blanket, and that's an effect of the atmosphere. The Earth is heated by the sun, but some of that heat is re-radiated by the Earth and then kept close to the Earth by the atmosphere. And the word for this is the greenhouse effect. This is not technically a very accurate name because real greenhouses don't quite work that way, but carbon dioxide is very good at absorbing radiant energy from the warm Earth and then radiating it right back to the Earth, reflecting it back to the Earth, like a blanket trapping your body heat and keeping it close to your body. Now, be it said that if there were no greenhouse effect at all, the Earth would have about the same surface temperature as the moon, which gets down at nights to something on the order of 150 degrees below Fahrenheit. It's the greenhouse effect that does keep the Earth from freezing solid. If we didn't have any greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, Earth would look like the planet Hoth on Star Wars: The Empire Strikes Back, Episode 5. I know you all saw it. And the way this all works, by the way, was worked out in 1896 by a guy by the name of Svante Arrhenius, a Swedish chemist, who also developed this concept of activation energy and helped us understand what enzymes do. And I'm bringing all of this up to point out that this is not some recent conspiracy to destroy US industry. We've understood how the greenhouse effect works and how it affects the Earth's climate for over 120 years. The science on here is pretty damn settled. Okay, but what about global warming and all of that? Well, I'll show you how this works. A guy by the name of Charles David Keeling set up a base in 1958 on the top of the mountain of Mauna Loa on the big island of Hawaii. Hawaii is, of course, a bunch of islands, but the largest island in that bunch is also called Hawaii. And to make it clear, if you're talking about the island or the state, most people just call the island of Hawaii the Big Island. And so he sets up this base on top of Mauna Loa, which is over 13,000 feet high. And he started making regular measurements of the concentration of carbon dioxide gas. And he did it there because Mauna Loa, the air is very pure. It's not downwind from any major source of pollution. And global weather patterns tend to keep the atmosphere very well mixed. So it's a good place to sample if you want to estimate what the entire atmosphere is doing. If you want to estimate the properties of all of the atmosphere, Mauna Loa is a good place to measure it. He did set up measuring stations in other parts of the world that basically confirmed his findings here. This wasn't the only place he made his observations, but this is where we're going to look at some data. What he found was that if you look at carbon dioxide levels, they are at their lowest in Northern Hemisphere September and October, and then they start rising and they hit a peak in about May, and then they drop down noticeably. The reason is that we have more land in the Northern Hemisphere than the South, just by chance. And there are some enormous forests in the Northern Hemisphere, covering much of Canada, covering much of Siberia, Northern Europe in general. And in spring of summer, those millions of miles of forest start to grow, and they start putting out leaves. And the leaves take in carbon dioxide to do photosynthesis. And we have so much forest up there that this regrowth of the leaves sucks carbon dioxide measurably right out of the atmosphere, draws the global concentration of CO2 down. In the fall, however, the leaves fall. That's why they call it fall. And growth stops. The trees go dormant over the winter. The dead leaves rot, and the decay of those dead leaves returns most of that carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. So what you're looking at here is a graph of the entire planet breathing, giving off carbon dioxide as decay predominates from fall into spring, and then breathing in carbon dioxide as photosynthesis predominates from about May to September. So the amount of carbon dioxide gas in the atmosphere changes with the seasons because of the global activity of forest in the Northern Hemisphere. However, the other thing that Keeling noted was that on top of that annual cycle, there's a long-term rise in carbon dioxide concentrations. You do have that annual cycle, but the cycle begins at a slightly higher point every year. And we've gone since 1958 from about um, 320 parts per million to over 400 parts per million over the course of about the past 65 or so years. The reason this might have something important to do with your life is that this tends to raise the average global temperatures, because the more carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, the better the atmosphere is at trapping that heat. And again, this is not something that was cooked up to destroy the American economy. The Presidential Scientific Advisory Board was warning of consequences of increasing global temperatures as far back as 1965, before I was even born. We've known about this for 55 or so years. Make of that what you will. The reason carbon dioxide concentrations are rising is that death and burial of once living organisms takes carbon dioxide out of the cycle for millions of years. Think about those oyster shells that you looked at pictures of in Lab 3. Those oyster shells are partly made of carbon. They're made of a mineral called calcium carbonate. That carbon used to be part of the carbon cycle, and then it got used to build those shells, back when those shells were living oysters, is what they were. That carbon got used to build those shells, and then the shells got buried. They've been out of the loop for about 70 million years. That's roughly how old those shells are. So when living things die and they get buried, the carbon that was part of their bodies gets locked out of the cycle. Now, there are some very carbon-rich remains of once living organisms, the so-called fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. And the name is quite accurate. Coal, oil, and natural gas are derived from the remains of once living organisms. People sometimes say that dinosaurs turned into oil. Strictly speaking, most of your oil would actually come from fossil plants and algae, much more so than dinosaurs. But the idea is the same, is that coal and oil and gas used to be living things. They lived, they died in great number, they got buried, and the burial process converted their biomass to beds of coal or source rock for petroleum, source rock for oil. What we've been doing by extracting and burning fossil fuels on an increasing scale since about 1850, we're taking carbon that used to be in the carbon cycle and then got locked out for many millions of years, and we're putting it back into circulation. We're putting it back into the atmosphere in the form of carbon dioxide gas when we burn coal and oil. As I've said, the greenhouse effect itself would be quite beneficial, because if we didn't have it, the Earth's surface would be as cold as the surface of the moon. Which reminds me that at a university I once attended, there was a bar that was locally known as the Moon because it had no atmosphere. That was a joke. I'm imagining you all laughing. There actually was a time about 750 million years ago when we think there was very few greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and the Earth did freeze over, and we had glaciers all the way to the equator. So without some degree of greenhouse effect, the Earth would be unlivable. Rising global temperatures now are starting to have noticeable effects on human life. Everything from increased intensity of hurricanes to increased flooding in coastal areas to insects and some of them pests adapted for warmer climates starting to migrate north. We're beginning to see the signs of this already. Global climate change is here, And some of the effects are going to be not very nice. They're not going to be things that we like. They're not going to be things that benefit the lives that we're living now. You get everything from shifting weather patterns, melting of the ice sheets, these the blue areas right there, those are regions of the Greenland ice cap. The bluer they are, the faster we're losing them. That has the potential to raise some sea levels and to start screwing with ocean circulation patterns. And a bunch of tree-hugging hippies known as the Department of Defense. That was a joke. They're not really tree-hugging hippies in the Department of Defense. But in 2014, the Pentagon declared that climate change posed a risk to U.S. national security. This is one reason why. Norfolk, Virginia is projected to see a sea level rise of 5 feet in the next 100 years. Norfolk happens to be home to the world's largest naval base. This is where we put our aircraft carriers. Rising sea levels are going to force us to spend money to upgrade and maintain our carrier port. Money that maybe we would rather spend on something else. Global climate change is one thing. If it damages agriculture, that can cause climate refugees. One of the reasons why ISIS in northern Iraq and Syria was so bad is because there had been 5 years of drought that had wrecked Syria's agriculture. That drove a lot of desperate farmers off the land. Having lost everything, they were more willing to listen to people who showed up and say, here, take this gun, and you can go get whatever revenge you feel you need to take. So yeah, you don't have to believe me, me being a tree-hugging hippie and all of that, but the Pentagon declared this back in 2014. This is ongoing, and it's real, and it's going to be a problem, and it's going to get worse. Right. On that cheerful note, let's move on to the nitrogen cycle. You have to have nitrogen because you need it for DNA bases and you need it for proteins. Amino acids all have to contain nitrogen. And there's lots of nitrogen in the atmosphere. 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen gas. The problem is that most organisms can't use it. Very few living things can take nitrogen gas and turn it into a form that metabolism can actually absorb. What turns nitrogen from the air into usable forms like ammonia and compounds called nitrates is two things. One is lightning. The other is bacteria that can take gas and turn it into something usable, and we call these nitrogen-fixing bacteria. So nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the soil take nitrogen gas, they convert it into forms that plants can use. Plants take up nitrogen gas from them, and then consumers eat the plants, and decomposers get their nitrogen from both, and so on. Ultimately, there's a whole nother set of bacteria called denitrifiers that break down nitrogen compounds and release nitrogen gas back into the atmosphere. So nitrogen is cycling from the atmosphere into ecosystems and back out because of lightning plus the actions of different types of bacteria. How does that play out? These are some soybean roots, and you can see they've got rounded lumps on them. These are legumes. Legumes is the family of plants that includes beans and peas and clover. It's called the family Fabaceae. Don't memorize that. But most of them have lumps on their roots that are packed full of nitrogen-fixing bacteria. They've got a symbiotic relationship with them, a mutualistic symbiosis. Not only do these bacteria provide nitrogen for the host plant, they make nitrogen available for other plants as well. So if you are growing a field or a garden or something like that, in the old days, what people used to do was rotate crops, which means that each one of your fields would be left and would not grow anything on it every third year. This gives a chance for things like clover to grow on it and put some nitrogen back into the soil and restore its fertility. I mean, to this day, you can one of the ways you can restore fertility to a garden is by planting some clover on it, letting it grow for about a year, and then you till it in and grow crops on top of that. That's a practice called green manure. Most of the nitrogen fertilizer that we use now, though, is made by a chemical process called the Haber-Bosch process, out of atmospheric nitrogen plus a hydrogen source like natural gas. This is a fertilizer plant that is able to suck nitrogen right out of the air and convert it into ammonia. Ammonia, which can be used to make other types of fertilizer, like ammonium nitrate. And ammonium nitrate is in the news. It's a very useful fertilizer, but it can explode. Ammonium nitrate was used in the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City in 1995. Timothy McVeigh used a truck packed with the stuff in order to blow up that building. And then it's looking like ammonium nitrate stored near the harbor of the city of Beirut is responsible for that huge explosion that has destroyed much of the city. That's been in the news yesterday and today. Okay, last cycle I'll talk about, the cycle of phosphorus. The major driving force here is rocks eroding. Rocks are always very slowly being broken down by the action of wind, water, freezing, plant roots growing among them, things like that. Rocks slowly tend to crumble and break down. Rock erosion releases the element phosphorus, which you need for DNA. Remember those phosphate groups? Yeah, living things need phosphorus for that reason, right? That's the P in schnapps. So as rocks erode, phosphorus is released. Plants might take up phosphorus from growing near crumbling rocks or something like that. Then the phosphorus in plants gets eaten by consumers, and the consumers get eaten by more consumers. Decomposers break everything down and return it to the soil, and so on. Ultimately, when plants die, some of their carbon gets washed into rivers. You know, I'm sure you've seen dead leaves floating on a stream. Those leaves contain some phosphorus, and some of that phosphorus will end up flowing downstream all the way to the oceans. It may end up staying there for millions of years in layers of sediment that build up on the bottom of the oceans, making those layers that we talked about when we talked about Steno's law, if you remember. And then very slow processes of mountain building ultimately form new exposures of rock and return phosphorus to the cycle. So erosion and building of rocks is what drives the phosphorus cycle. The phosphorus that we need for agriculture is mostly mined from areas that are rich in phosphate-rich rock, like this mine in the country of Morocco. You can grind up phosphate-rich rock and add it to your soil. Unfortunately, we don't know how much phosphate rock we've still got, and there's concern that they're going to start collapsing in the next 30 years. We may end up mining most of our available phosphorus supplies. Okay, here's the thing. In modern industrial agriculture, if you're growing corn up in Iowa, you add nitrogen and phosphorus to your soil every year, probably more than you really need. Now, corn requires a lot of fertilizer, and farmers probably add more than necessary. Whatever the plants don't use ends up washing out of the soil. As you can see here, this drainage ditch right next to a field is receiving rainwater that has flowed through the soil, and excess nitrogen and phosphorus are washing out of that field and running into the drainage ditch, which feeds into a river, or might feed into a lake, which will feed into a river. And when you have a lake or other body of water suddenly getting a huge input of nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, all of a sudden there's lots of food for algae and bacteria, and you get what we call an algal bloom. So here's a lake that's got an algal bloom on it, and the water's green and it's covered with mats of green slime. Well, the green slime is mats of photosynthetic protists, or algae, and also photosynthetic bacteria. You might think this would be great because other living things could feed on those. But what happens when you get too many algae and bacteria is they'll live, as all things do, they die, they fall to the bottom and they rot, and the decay process consumes oxygen. The end result is that the water becomes so oxygen depleted that nothing can live in it. If there were fish in this lake, they're probably dead now. There's no oxygen in the water because of all the rotting algae. And so when this happens in lakes, you tend to see things like fish kills. This was actually a problem in Lake Conway roughly 15 or so years ago. There were actually a bunch of houses on the shores of Lake Conway that had leaky septic systems. So Lake Conway, around the areas where there's houses, was getting big, influxes of, sewage, people's poop, was turning the water green because you have lots of algae that are feeding on the fertilizer, the sewage, and starting to become a problem for fish. And I actually remember when they drained the entire lake to give everybody a chance to fix their septic systems. This is something you don't want in your typical lake, and it's called eutrophication. You can see this in lakes and farm ponds around Arkansas. Sometimes you can see it on a really big scale. That is Lake Erie. That big blue thing in the middle, that's Lake Erie. You have Ohio south of it, and also bits of Pennsylvania and New York on the south end. The North Shore, that's actually part of Ontario, part of Canada. Let me see, Detroit is up there. It's in there, kind of up and to the left a little bit. You've got, more on the left side, there's kind of a gray patch. That's Detroit. And there's cities on the Great Lakes. One of them's Toledo on the south side, Toledo, Ohio. South of there, you have lots of farmland. Ohio, and also, Indiana is also in there. Those are pretty rural states. And when farmers spread lots of fertilizer on their fields, some of it washes off and ends up in the lake. Some sewage coming from the towns and cities also washes into the lake. And what you get is these massive blooms of algae. And you can see it as those green swirly areas, kind of at the lower left end of the lake. A lot of that water is not deep blue. It's swirly green. That's caused by growth of algae, this bloom of algae that is, I'm guessing, 50, 100 miles long. Some algae actually produce toxins, and in August 2014, Toledo temporarily had to shut off its water supply. They would normally be taking their water straight from Lake Erie, but there were so many algae in the water that the water treatment plants couldn't get rid of it. The water supply became unsafe. 400,000 people had to go without water for a couple of days. So eutrophication can be pretty big. It's also affecting the Gulf of Mexico. There's a huge eutrophied zone in the Gulf of Mexico, all that red area here, because all of the sewage and runoff from half of North America drains into the Mississippi River. That red area is a zone of eutrophication, and the water below that red zone is so low in oxygen that few animals can make a living there. This is an area called the dead zone, and it's a threat to things like commercial seafood fisheries. About a third of U.S. seafood comes out of the Gulf of Mexico, and the seafood harvest will not be done any favors by a big oxygen depleted zone in the middle of the Gulf. You hear a lot about organic farming and organic food being, super good for you, so you pay a premium price for it at, high-end grocery stores like Whole Foods. And the science is kind of mixed on how much better it is for you. It depends. The real point of organic farming is you take advantage of natural cycling as much as possible. What a conventional farmer would do is, buy a bunch of nitrogen fertilizer, spread it on his field, plant corn. The excess fertilizer gets washed into the ocean. The corn eventually gets harvested and sold, wash, rinse, and repeat. So the nitrogen, he buys it and it goes from the fields, washes into the rivers, ends up in the sea. It's kind of a one-way trip. Things like composting, where you take your waste food and waste plants and you let them decay in a controlled way, and you spread the product of that decay back in your field. The idea is that you're keeping your nitrogen cycling through your local ecosystem rather than letting it wash out. Now, some of it ultimately does wash out, but you can keep more of your nitrogen and more of your phosphorus and more of other nutrients there on the land where you need it, instead of having to buy it, spread it, and then lose it when you're done with it. So the idea of organic farming, organic agriculture, is to turn as many of those one-way trips into cycles as possible and imitate the natural cycling that you see in nature. Some of the early works on organic farming were written by people who had the sense to ask the question, why don't you have to fertilize a forest? And the answer, of course, is that dead leaves in a forest, as they rot, return nutrients to the soil gets used by new generations of trees, and you have much more of a cycle instead of a one-way flow. That's what ecosystems do, and that's what organic farming and gardening try to do. You keep as many of your nutrients on your land and let them cycle rather than constantly having to add more. Okay, that's a pretty good stopping place. So I will stop presenting and